Hello, welcome to Mr. Miles Maths. Today we are looking at directed numbers, in particular multiplication and division. So this is multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers. If you haven't looked at the video on addition and subtraction, that's there too. These are the two other operations, multiplication and division. This should be quite quick, not that much different from normal multiplication. We've just got to look at the signs and pay attention to those carefully. So now that we've introduced negative numbers, things like -5 instead of 5, we can now multiply 5 by -3, for example. So we can multiply by a negative. We need to know what happens when we do that. In fact, we can actually multiply a negative by a negative, and we need to know what happens when we do that as well. So the rules for this I've written down at the top here. If you're multiplying a positive by a negative, or a negative by a positive, so positive by negative or negative by positive, then you end up with a negative answer. So if one of the things is negative and the other is positive, you'll always get a negative answer. You've kind of got one negative sign and that holds through in the answer. If you multiply two positive things, that's what you're kind of used to doing, 4 times 3, positive times positive, you get a positive. But also if you multiply a negative by a negative, you also get a positive. So the negatives kind of cancel each other out. And that's the general rule for this. If you have an odd number of negative signs, like this at the top, then you get a negative answer. If you have an even number of negative signs, then you will get a positive answer. Again, loads of examples, and that should help you to figure out what's going on. So number one, we're just going to evaluate these. So let's see if we do 4 times by -3, what we end up with. Now, the nice thing about this is that the calculation doesn't change. The value doesn't really change. 4 times 3 is still 12. But because we've got that one negative sign, this is 4 times -3 or -3, we get 12. But because one of them is negative, we'll end up with -12. So a positive times a negative gives us a negative. Simple as that. Number two, -7 times by 6. And again, really important that you know your times tables for this, otherwise you just can't do it. -7 times 6, so 7 sixes are 42. But because I've got one negative sign in front of the -7, it's -7 times 6. My answer will be -42. -8 times 5 is a -8 times a +5. -8 times 5 will be -40. Still get my 8 times 5 value, which is 40, but because I've got one negative in there, I end up with a negative answer. Negative times a positive. If we have a negative times by a negative, like -2 times -9, we actually end up with the same as 2 times 9. The negatives cancel each other out. So a negative times a negative gives us a positive answer. Okay, and there aren't many more options to this because when you multiply or divide or subtract or add, you're either adding or subtracting something positive or adding or subtracting something negative, or you're multiplying two positives, two negatives, or a positive and a negative in either order. Okay, they're the options that you've got. So this kind of covers everything. Number 5, let's show that again. So -3 times by -11. 3 times 11 is 33. -3 times -11 is also going to be 33. The negative times by the negative gives us a positive answer. The negatives kind of cancel. And it's exactly the same if we look at some questions on division. So let's do division. So if I do -12 divided by +6 and -12 divided by a positive, we've got one negative sign there, so we get a negative answer. 12 divided by 6 stays the same, still going to be 2. So -12 divided by 6 is -2. So it works in pretty much the same way as multiplication, except we are dividing, of course, because that's what it asks for. We could have something like 42 divided by -7. This is a positive 42 divided by a negative. So we still do 42 divided by 7, but because one is positive and the other is negative, we're going to get a -6 rather than a 6. And it's the same if we have two negatives. So if we have -72 divided by -9, the negatives cancel, so we end up with a positive answer. -72 divided by -9 is +8. So the calculation, very, very similar. We've just got to pay attention carefully to those signs. And Always include signs in your calculation, and that will give you the sign in your answer. And if you get good and confident with this, it will play a massive part in algebra, solving equations, all the really important things that you need it for. Let's do a couple more. Let's do minus 50 divided by minus 10. So a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive answer. 50 divided by 10 is 5. And you should get quite quick at this as you go along. And then one more, number 10. We'll do 27 divided by, no, minus 27 divided by 9. And this is a negative 27 divided by a positive. So negative divided by positive. We still do 27 divided by 9. But because it's a negative divided by a positive, we get negative 3 rather than positive 3. And if you want to make it a bit trickier, you can look at multiplying decimals or fractions. I'll just show you a quick example of what I mean. So 4 times by minus 2.5. So I should be able to straight away say a positive 4 times by a negative number, negative 2.5. I know my answer will be negative. And you kind of take care of the signs almost separately. Positive times a negative gives me a negative. If I want to multiply something like this, forget the negative for now because we've kind of covered that. To multiply 4 by 2.5, people get a bit confused when you throw in fractions. Just do 4 times 2, which is 8. 4 times the half, and that 2 and the half makes the 2.5. 4 times a half is just a half of 4, which is 2. And then add them together. So here I will end up with minus 10. And it works the same for decimals. If I have minus 0.7 times by minus 3, again, I can quickly look at a negative times by a negative. So my answer will be positive and kind of take that into account straight away. Positive answer. When I do 0.7 times by 3, I can do 3 7s are 21. And I've got one decimal place in the question. So I can just put my decimal place 1 in the answer. So this will just be 2.1. And then the last little bit I'm going to look at is just what happens if you have more than one kind of calculation to do. So we'll do a couple of questions, 13, 14, and 15, in fact, 3 questions where we have more than one calculation happening. So we have something like 4 times minus 3 times by minus 2. And either you can treat this separately like you would do 4 times 3 times 2. If we're doing 4 times 3 times 2, we probably think I'll do the 4 times 3 first is 12, and then times the 2 afterwards and get 24, which is absolutely fine. With the different signs, you can do it exactly like that, or you can think about the signs as a whole from the start. So if you've got a positive times a negative, the outcome of this will be negative, and your times ended up by a negative, so your overall outcome will be positive. Or what I probably like to do is times the first 2 things together. 4 times minus 3 is minus 12. So this will be minus 12 times minus 2. Negative times a negative is positive. And 12 times 2 is 24. So you're kind of breaking it into those 2 sums like you would do if they were just all 3 positive numbers. And then we could have minus 2 times by minus 8 times by minus 1. Again, break it into bits. Minus 2 times minus 8. Negative times a negative is positive 16. Times by negative 1 is a positive times a negative. So we'll have a negative answer. 16 times 1 is 16, so it's minus 16. So once you get good at multiplying 2 numbers together, this should be a short extension. You do the first calculation first, get an answer, and then times that by the next thing, and always take into account the signs that you're using. And we'll do one more question. So 5 times by 3 times by minus 4. And again, 5 times 3 times minus 4. I'll do the 5 times 3 first, which is positive times a positive, so I get positive 15, multiplied by the negative 4 that's just left over. So I'll do 15 times 4, which is 60. Because it's a negative times a positive here at the end, negative 4 and positive 15, I will get a negative answer because of that. And you can stack up division in the same kind of way. So bear in mind all your kind of negatives and positives whenever you're doing any calculations, and you should be fine. And then you can actually think about things like powers. So if you have a negative to a particular power, minus 2 to the power of 4, so to the power of 4 means multiplied by itself 4 times over, and you can think about how many kind of negative signs there are, or you can kind of stack them up as you go along, but you'll notice when you have an even number or an even power, you get an even number of negative signs, and they will all cancel out, so you'll actually get a positive answer for this. This will be positive 16. Whereas if you've got an odd number, like minus 3 to the 3. I'll write it underneath. Yes, you can think of it like this, but if you're quite clever, you can think, well, this is an odd power, and therefore I'll be having an odd number of negative times together. Therefore, my answer will definitely be negative. 3 times 3 times 3 is 27, which means you can get things like minus 5 to the power of 10, for example. And this is going to be a very big number, minus 5 times minus 5 times minus 5, 10 times over. But if you said to me, what's the sign of this going to be? I can say my answer will be positive, whatever 5 to the 10 is, because I'll have those negatives all cancelling out because there's an even number of them. Whereas if I have minus 7 to the 5, this outcome will be, again, big number because it's minus 7 times minus 7, 5 times over. But because it's an odd power, I'll have an odd number of negative signs, and that means I'll end up with a negative outcome because of that. Hopefully this has helped with your directed numbers. So all the positives and negatives covered in this video and the addition and subtraction video that I've done as well. And if you found this useful, please like the video and watch more and hit the subscribe button. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Thank you, see ya.